key thing that allows me to jump between the different genres of photography is my ability to light. So I learned lighting from my mentor, Dean Collins. Dean Collins was teaching something called three-dimensional contrast, and three-dimensional contrast was what I call the Rosetta Stone of lighting, because it taught photographers how to create, control, and identify light quality and light quantity, creating soft light, hard light, creating direction of light, controlling shadow contrast, specular contrast, specular edge transfer, shadow edge transfer, just a whole slew of things. I studied with Dean in Southern California in the mid-1980s, and learning this stuff was amazing because he taught us that there was a finite number of controls and a finite number of principles involved. It was a lot of stuff to learn, a ton of stuff to learn, but it was finite. It isn't like the way most photographers learn lighting, which is a very weak way to learn, which is strictly methodology. That is learning lighting recipes, lighting setups that you just recreate over and over again. That really doesn't allow you to create anything different or new, or when you run into trouble to problem solve effectively, you end up having to use trial and error. So this method of principle-based learning means that you can do things you've never done before, and you can figure it out in most cases rather rapidly. And when things are going wrong, you can figure out how to fix it pretty fast too. So it was a great thing. Unfortunately, Dean's no longer with us and he's sorely missed, but his legacy lives on through myself and just a few other people that actually embraced his teachings. So I'm just going to open up a different little show here. So on Dave on Demand, I actually have this shot in there. It uses Hypersync, but I just want to talk a little bit about lighting or how we see. Okay, so when you pick up a camera and take a picture, you flatten out reality. You take depth and time and truncate it down to just height and width. So we're always fighting to separate our subjects out from the background. So if you look at this photograph here, she's somewhat separated out from the background because of depth of field. So we can use depth of field, like if I shoot with my lens wide open, in this case f4, she's in sharp focus, but the background's out of focus. And this kind of mimics the way our eyes work. Like for instance, if I look at my fingers right now, they're sharp in focus, but everything behind and everything coming up towards me from that starts to go out of focus. So that is how we see, because the fact is we don't actually see in 3D. We see 2D stereo. Because we have two eyes, our retinas are two-dimensional, so they image two-dimensionally. But we see two images slightly offset, and then in our brain they converge together. So one side is seeing further down here, one side further down here, but it converges together, gives us an illusion of depth. But we're also relying heavily on the fact when we're looking at things of that sort of depth of field aspect to separate things out. We can also use perspective. So if you are using architecture, photographing people, again, architecture for instance, if you set them up in such a way that you have diverging, converging lines, this helps to give a sense of depth to your image. But the single most powerful way of creating depth in your image is lighting. Okay, if you look at this picture of my model Kelsey Barnwell, a very trim, slim woman, but this shot makes her look pretty thick through the neck. Part of it is the pose is very, you know, kind of a dramatic pose, and portrait photographers are really in glamour, beauty, are against that sort of thing, but I want to show her as being strong and whatnot, so I want to see strength in her neck and whatnot. But it looks pretty ugly here because the image is flattened out. Her nose is closer to us, her chin is closer to us, and all this is further away, but as soon as you take a picture, it's all flattened out on the same plane, so she starts to look really thick. But if we take some lighting, like if we add some shadow in here, as we darken tones, they recede into the background. And as we lighten tones, they pull forward in the image, okay? And those things, pull forward, recede, those Those are words that describe depth, okay? So that is exactly what this is doing. So in this image, she's standing against that background. I'm using color harmony. So I want to create a cold background behind her so that the dress can contrast to it, because it's this bright, vibrant red, so we want it to really punch out. Here she is against the background. The background is about a half a kilometer to a full kilometer away from her, so quite distant. And that really helps me to create this depth of field difference, because I'm shooting this at f4, wide open on this lens. So when you're shooting a full length of a person, f4 is not like f4 when you shoot just a headshot. You just do a headshot, you know, the eyes are sharp, but it starts to go out of focus right away. In this, there's, you know, if you look down here, you can see the zone of sharpness, so it's quite a bit. So the more you reduce the actual sizes of your subjects, their reproduction on the imaging sensor of your camera, the more depth of field you have, okay? So at f4 is soft, but it's still not super soft if you see the background there. So by having the background further away helped to keep it softer, more out of focus. And that was a really critical thing for this, because I want to use that separation of sharp and unsharp to make her stand out in the photograph. The color harmony, the fact that everything is blue, because everything is lit by, like the fronts of these buildings, is lit by the open sky behind the camera. So that is creating blue light. And so that blue contrasts beautifully to the warm red of the dress. And also, warm colors pull forward and cold colors fall back in an image as well. So that's another way of separation in this that just works beautifully, I think. So having the faraway background allows me to have the background more out of focus. But because I wanted the background to loom over her, you know, when you get further and further away from the background, you know, she stays big, but it gets smaller and smaller. So if you walk, once you've got her a good distance away, if you walk further away from her, in fact, I was about 3.5 meters away from her, roughly 10 feet away. And at that distance, now the background starts to appear bigger behind her, because basically what I'm doing is compressing perspective. As you move further away from the subject, the differences between the subject's size and the background size start to even out. As you move closer, the background starts to get smaller. The subject, you know, you fill the frame with them, but the background gets smaller. So being far away from the subject was an important factor. The other thing I did to make her look more magnificent or more strong is that I placed my camera down low. So it's about 3 feet off the ground, or roughly 1 meter off the ground. So pointing up at her a little bit. Okay, so lighting. The sun backlights her, but some of that sun strafes across and hits behind the camera the open sky. So the open sky light is lighting the front of her. Now this is just the available light. An incident meter, I held the incident meter up to the open sky, took a reading with the white dome, and it read 160th of a second if I wanted to shoot at f4 at 100 ISO, and that correctly exposed her the way you see her here. But notice how blue she looks. That's because I haven't corrected the color balance, because this is just a setup shot. You notice this is burned out, her hair is totally burned out, her arm is totally burned out, and the background is too close in tone to her tone, so we don't have much separation going on there. Now, what if we were to just underexpose the ambient light, okay? Like now the buildings go darker, the sky will go darker, the rim lighting on her will go darker. So instead of being our main light now, it'll become a low-level fill light. And to do that, first of all, I had to figure out how much do I underexpose it. Well, in the old days, I would have taken my light meter, my reflective meter, 1 degree spot meter, and pointed at different areas, read it, and then visualize what those brightnesses would look like, and then decide and set my shutter speed to darken down the background, okay, leaving the aperture at f4. But with digital, it's so much easier. I just picked up my camera, pointed it roughly in the direction that she would be standing, and then just did a bracket. 8,000ths, 4,000ths, 2,000ths, 1,000ths, 500th. I decided that between 1,000ths and a 2,000ths would look about right, so I set my camera a 1/1600th of a second. And there we have it. So, look at this. We've got a beautiful blue sky. Now it's nice and dark behind her. We have a super low level fill on her, but obviously she's really underexposed. We can't see the dress, we can't see her face. So what are we going to do about that? Well, at this point, we're shooting at a 1/1600th of a second, so that's 3 1/3 stops below what we had before. So we're going to add in a main light. So this is a 0.6 by 1 meter or 2 by 3 foot softbox with the inner baffle removed so that we have as much power as possible. And this main light is about 2.5 meters away from the subject. So it's about 9 feet away from her, I guess. The main light height is about 8 feet high, pointing down at her. You know, first thing you do, you decide what aperture you want to shoot at for depth of field. Now everything is relative to that. With my camera set to f4, it stays like that, and I just compare any lighting, any metering I do to what the camera is set at. So f4 equals middle gray on a grayscale. So if I want her to be correctly exposed, all I have to do is set the power on the main light. So this is a very powerful strobe hooked into a battery, and it's firing the light directly onto her. And wherever that light strikes her, it's hitting her at f4. So an incident meter reading would tell you that. So you take a reading and you would change the power until it read f4. In fact, this thing was turned up to full power to give us f4 on her. And then if that is f4 and the camera's set to f4, when you take the picture, she'll be correctly exposed. Now in a minute, I'll talk about why this had to be so powerful. Okay, so here we have it. And now that's that f4 amount of light striking her. So look at how much depth we've got. So, you know, the shadows are quite dark. There's still some detail in them, but that's a -3 3/10 shadow. So way dark. So just to recap, we start out, there's the available light. Okay, we look at what it's doing. We decide how to underexpose it. Typically if I'm going out and I don't have time to really think and figure it out, I just use a formula. I just underexpose by 2 stops. It's a good general setting that works most of the time. Gives a little bit of drama. If you don't want so much drama, make it underexposed by 1 stop, okay? But I first of all set my aperture to what I want to shoot at for depth of field, pick the shutter speed that goes with that, and then underexpose it by 1 stop, 2 stops, or 3 stops, or here 3 1/3 stops to get the brightness level that I want. Okay, so you can see that brightness level, it's quite dark, but it's still not totally black, so it's a low level fill. The buildings are dark, the sky is nice and dark, and now our rim lighting is perfect. And then finally, we bring in our artificial light, the strobe in a softbox, and we're lighting it here. Now, the reason why I needed to have so much power is that I was doing a technique, so this basically comes under the heading of like high-speed sync, because if you're shooting at a 1/1600th of a second, your camera shutter can't work with that, because when you shoot above a 200th of a second, the way your shutter works is it opens up and it travels down like this, so it's like it's scanning it, okay? So it's like each part is getting that 1/1600th of a second of exposure. It's different from when you shoot at sync speeds. Below a 200th, the shutters work like this. The first one drops, the second one comes down, meets it, reset. Okay, so it's a different way that the shutter has to work. So with Hypersync, I'm not going to go into it in any depth here, just very briefly I'll describe it because I've got a really in-depth video on this further back in Dave on Demand. It's a 2-part video that takes you through it, all the nuts and bolts and how to set up your testing to do your Hypersync, and even a way so that you can actually meter Hypersync, because you really can't otherwise. Hypersync relies on the fact that when you fire a strobe, it's not instant light like we think it is. It happens so fast, but it is light over time, just a very short period of time. So it basically peaks right away, and then there's a gradual trailing off of the light. Now the trouble is, while your shutter is scanning, it means that if you just catch the peak, part of your image would be very bright and the rest of it will be black. Okay, so you'll get lines, or the whole thing will just be black. Like, it just doesn't work. So with Hypersync, what it does is it actually misses the peak and then just catches the trailing off. So that's why you need so much power to do it. So old strobe, you need a lot of power and you need slow flash duration. That's how long it takes the flash to pump out its juice. Older flashes tend to have slower flash durations, and more powerful strobes tend to have slower flash duration. So I'm using an old strobe that is very powerful. So it takes a lot of light to do this because you're missing most of the burst of light and just getting the trailing off of light. So high-speed sync works in a different way, in that as this is happening with the shutter, it's pulsing the light. So you're getting, so that actually takes a fair bit of power as well, because you're only getting part of what that light can pump out each time. I don't know how many times it fires, but let's say it fires 10 times. So each position of the blades can only get like 1/10 the light. Those numbers are not accurate, but the concept is roughly right.